You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestall. On this episode, I'm delighted to welcome Brett Manning to join me. Brett has built a reputation as a creator of wonderful works of art and clothing, and has recently released the fabulous book, 1 Foot in the Green. The book is a collection of wonderful creatures from across the globe and features hundreds of illustrations, and for me, is a work of art in its own right. Brett joins me to discuss her love of cryptids, the world of the fae and folklore, and shares some personal experiences of haunted houses, black shucks, and UFOs. But as always, before that, don't forget you can support Mysteries and Monsters by signing up at patreon.com/mysteriesandmonsters. $4 a month gets you ad-free episodes, guaranteed early releases, bonus content, and competitions. You can also click the link in the show notes as normal. Mysteries and Monsters is also across all social media platforms: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Mastodon, and please subscribe to the Mysteries and Monsters channel on YouTube. You can also visit mysteriesandmonsters.com for episodes, news, and Mysteries and Monsters merchandise. Thank you as always to Dean Bestall for his marvellous artwork. The show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys, and Mysteries and Monsters is delighted to be a part of the Straight Up Strange network. So let's join Brett as we enter the world of the fae and folklore. Today, I'm delighted to return to the world of the curious in the company of the marvellous Brett Manning, an artist of extreme talent, a creator of beautiful garments, author, and occasionally the hilarious creepy photo shoot that Brett will show online invites us all to imagine who or what may lurk in our peripheral vision, peering at us from behind the veil. Brett, welcome.
Hello.
This is one of those strange conversations, Brett, that I start where I feel like I already know you, but this is the first time we've ever spoken properly.
That's true, but I feel the same. I feel like I've known you in a way for several years. So, very nice to actually talk to you.
Yes, likewise. I think we all come under a certain umbrella of the weird and our connections between us.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Spiderweb of weirdos.
Oh, absolutely. Ever growing as well, it would seem.
Yes.
Brett, you are someone, as I mentioned in the introduction, one of the most jaw-droppingly inspiring artists I've come across since I've been doing this show, as I've spoken to people and learnt more and been connected to more things and seen more things. You were somebody I became aware of just before I started my program, and I have to say that you are one of those artists that my life would be less if I'd never come across your work. For anybody that's not aware of your kind of style and your influences, without wishing to sort of dumb it down or make it sound a little less than the content of its parts, what is your kind of sort of style in regards to the kind of work that you like to promote and produce?
Well, first of all, thank you. That was really nice. I'm dumbfounded, or dumbstruck. Just dumb. But my style, I primarily work in ink. It's very illustrative. So a lot of kind of like early 1900s traditional ink illustration has been something that I am always drawn to. I always mention this, but Beatrix Potter was probably my first favorite artist, and she remains one of my favorites today. So just a very, I don't know how to describe it. It's fantastical. It's very emotive. It's very diary-like. It's very meditative in how I create. So it's a lot of things, but the medium is usually ink on paper, sometimes watercolor.
I've always been very impressed with your work because I think sometimes when we look at people who create such wonderful creatures of our imagination, they would suppose that that's something that you've always started with. But I know when I've heard you speak about your starting points and what you used to like drawing, you were attracted to the animal kingdom firstly, really, and that's what sort of set you off, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I was always like, I thought when I grew up, I was I wanted to be an artist, but my second thing I wanted to do was be an animal biologist. So I was this young child studying like Latin names and all kinds of dorky things that most 7, 8-year-old kids probably don't do. I was just obsessed with the animal kingdom and loved drawing portraits of them. Just very like thoughtful, like portraits, not just an animal drawing, but something that was more meaningful in a way, which is kind of interesting for maybe a child to be doing. But when I look at things that I've drawn in the past, they have a lot of very funny personality to them.
I know that you were of a very similar age when you got bitten by the cryptid bug, because I think what often gets overlooked in your body of work and the things that you put online and the creations that you bring to us is that you have a deep love of cryptids as well as the magical and the fantastical. Now, I think you've got a very similar backstory to me in regards to what bit you here, Brett, though your version of the story is probably slightly different to mine. Mine is, I had the misfortune of seeing Snow Beast on TV here when I was 8, and I was not expecting to be scared that much at 7 o'clock on a Saturday night in the UK. And then 5 days later, I saw the Patterson Gimlin film for the first time ever.
Oh,
and I'd gone from being terrified to being obsessed.
Back to back. Yeah. I feel like terror and obsession are very closely linked, though, because that is kind of how I fell into this. I watched Unsolved Mysteries often as a child and was absolutely terrified, but also so just enthralled. And I just constantly needed to know more and like hear more stories that people were telling and more image descriptions, things that they'd seen or heard. It was just fascinating to me.
So this episode that featured on Unsolved Mysteries about a Bigfoot that knocked on windows, I suspect is the one that set it off for you, is it?
That's the one, because I always shared a room with my sisters and I had the top bunk. For some reason, I would always think there would be a Sasquatch standing outside the window and I would be like at eye level with it at the window because I was sleeping up high, or it'd be like creeping around the corner of the window, peeking in. I just had that thought in the back of my head so often before I fell asleep. And yeah, it was so scary, but just obviously obsessed with it. So whatever that means, I don't know.
So from that point on, was it something, because often we forget here in the UK that we didn't really have access to things like that. Most of the cryptid paraphernalia we would be able to get hold of here in those early days would be to do with either Nessie or the Yeti. So Bigfoot was something that didn't really get to here until sort of towards the end of the 80s, unless you were in the know and kept your eye on things going on in North America. So for yourself, was it a fact that from that Unsolved Mysteries, you just basically hit the ground running and tried to find out as much as you possibly could in, as you say, both with an equal measure of fear and excitement?
Yeah, I think as I started to become more, I guess acquainted is a weird word, but just like reading books and things about it, I wasn't as scared anymore. I was more just completely fascinated. And that went on. I mean, it never ended, but I hear so many people say that when they hit the age of like 13 or something, they kind of like start thinking about other things. And that was definitely the case. When I was in high school, I hated school. So my main focus then was just like getting through school and doing my art.
Yeah.
And I really only started becoming more acquainted with that obsession again after I finally graduated from college, probably.
Mhm.
So took a little hiatus, but it was always there.
So was it that kind of thing? And I'm sure, you know, as I'm fortunate to count you as a regular listener. Is it that kind of situation where you basically tried to suppress it until it eventually burst out, Brett? Or did you get to a point where you just thought, I don't give a damn what you think? This is me, and this is how I am. Like it or lump it.
It was probably more like that, just completely embracing who I know I am, things I like, not being embarrassed or ashamed of them. And also just paired with a very strange experience I had when I was around 22. If you want me to tell that story, I can. I've never told it before, so...
Go for it.
Okay. So I was just I had graduated college and needed to get an actual job, and I started working at a place that was beyond miserable. It was literally, it felt like it was sucking my soul from me all the time.
Yes.
And I couldn't deal with that anymore. And so I quit, and I had been in this is hard to tell. I was in such like the worst depression I've ever been in my life. I'm extremely emotional. And so this was the worst it had ever been. It felt like all I did was lay in bed. And when I was laying in bed, I felt like I was deep in a dark, cold pit of earth.
Yeah.
Like I was just trapped. And I remember just like thinking to myself, this is not me. I don't want to feel like this, but all these things around me were just horrible. And I just hauled out to like whatever magical forces there were. If they could help me this one time, it would be amazing. And I suddenly felt this like a shock of electricity go through my entire body. And I instantly felt just like myself again. And I know this is like a difficult story to tell because depression is super real.
Yeah.
And this is not going to be how people are fixed or helped, like hardly ever. But this was just something I experienced. And I still deal with depression every once in a while, you know, but it has never been that bad. But during this time, I felt like something actually came through, like some supernatural something. And just like, I don't know what it was. But from then on, it was like, I am just going to do exactly what I love. Why would I ever work at a job like that would just kill me from the inside out? So that's kind of where it kicks back again, as dark as that is.
Yeah. I mean, I have something very similar myself, Brett, because I was seriously ill with my mental health. And that really, I mean, like you, it's something that I've learned to deal with a lot, which I think a lot of people who suffer from depression do, especially in the modern era. Thankfully, things are a lot better for a lot of us, and we can be more open and honest about our challenges and the struggles we have. And I still have bad days these days, but by God, they're a lot less than they used to be, I have to say. Primarily, I always joke, doing this show and reconnecting with my love of these subjects is probably what saved my life. And, you know, it's like you say, I was in that kind of situation where, so why am I not indulging in the things that I'm passionate about and love rather than trying to fit in, you know? And sometimes that makes you ill, I think.
I think that's what I was experiencing. Definitely. And I don't know, just finding my true self again and letting me be myself, it just made a huge difference. And it was just so weird though, because I felt like a shock of electricity go through my entire body instantly. And that I can't explain, but
yeah, I mean, I was signed off work and I was ill in bed, and I just thought, well, I've got a few weeks off, and I was whacked out on meds. And I thought, and I managed to keep hold of some wonderful books that I had as a younger person, from poltergeists and ghosts and everything. And I just started reading them. I just basically lay in bed and read for 10 hours, which for me is one of my ideas of heaven, personally.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful.
And just get up for a cup of tea or something.
Mm-hmm.
And I found a poltergeist story, because I've always loved poltergeist. And I'd never heard it. And I thought, hang on a minute, how have I missed this story? And then I thought, surely this can't be what they're saying is. And I started Googling it, and I found all these articles and newspaper reports from the 1950s. And I thought, whoa, why do I not know more about this particular story? And it was that for me, that very similar to what you're saying. I didn't have so much of a physical reaction to what was happening, but it suddenly felt, I was still very ill and not feeling brilliant, but all of a sudden I thought, yeah, I don't know what I'm going to do with this, but I know I'm going to do something with it. Now, wherever it was going to take me, who knows? I mean, my brother had been on at me for years to start podcasting and speaking to people around the world, primarily because he kept saying, you do actually know a fair bit about weird things, so why don't you just talk to more people who know about weird things as well? So that finding that story got me to the point that a year later I was running about on the street that this incident had happened in in Runcorn, taking pictures of the house secretly because somebody lived in it, and I didn't want them thinking I was some kind of weird peeping Tom, So it's amazing how sometimes when you at your lowest ebb, something comes along that suddenly makes you realise that, yeah, to hell with this, I'm going to do what I want to do, because that's the reason I feel like this is primarily the fact that I'm not grabbing on to the things I love.
Yeah, that was definitely part of it. And also just having some weird brain chemical imbalance. But on top of that, there was things that I should have been doing the whole time that just kind of helped me maintain and feel far better. I think you know what I mean, but I hope I'm not coming off as saying that this is what you need. You don't need medication, because that's not true at all.
No,
and I don't believe that. Anybody who tells you that doesn't know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
But I do think having something you can be passionate about is highly beneficial.
Oh, of course it is. Of course it is. Anything that releases endorphins is going to make anybody who suffers from depression or bouts of stupor and things like that, right? It's going to make you feel better, even if it's just a little bit. It's going to help. Anything you enjoy that gives you pleasure will help and get those chemicals racing about a bit more than they are.
Yeah, absolutely.
So was it at that point from on, because obviously as we touched on, you were a lover of cryptids and you enjoyed art and drawing. Where did the attraction to the fae and the unseen come from then? Was that something that you'd also nurtured through your sort of teenage years and your artwork?
Honestly, no, not at all, which is very strange for some people, because I feel like I've had people think that I've been drawing different fairies my whole life, but it's kind of a new thing. And I feel like this is going to sound very silly, but I feel like they found me and started just kind of, because I've always been very meditative. And when I'm creating, it's very calming to me, very soothing. And it is like how I meditate. And I feel like they've just come through while I do that. And I can't really even pinpoint. I feel like I heard a podcast several years ago. It was probably around 5 or 6, well, maybe about 7 years ago when we moved to the farmhouse we live in now. And I heard somebody tell a story about something they saw while they were in Ireland and how that was a fairy. And it was very human-like, very tall. And I don't even, it was like the whole Bigfoot thing all over again. I just instantly locked on and was like, oh, this is calling to me. I have to like research this. And sure enough, I became fairly obsessed. And that is where different creature bestiary books that I've done came in. And then I was working on this very large compilation of those books with a lot of new work in it as well. So that book is the One Foot in the Green that I just published.
Mm.
really, they found me.
The thing I love about this book that's been released this year is that when I look at it, as I said to you before we started this, and I'm not over complimenting anybody when I say this, but it's easily one of the most beautiful things I've ever read. One of the joys of doing this show and getting to know the people I've met in a variety of fields is I've realized just how many talented people there are out there around the world dealing with subjects that 5 years ago I probably didn't give any credit or interest to, because I was very snobbish, I suggest, about certain aspects of folklore and the world around the weird, and I would only go so far into it. I'd only sort of dip my toe into certain pools, Brett, as it were. Now, here I am, as we have this conversation at Christmas 2022, I am someone who is embracing all aspects of the weird to a point that the person who used to like the weird 5 years ago would think I'd gone way out of the way now. But I just find it so fascinating that I'd shut myself off from so many interesting topics, especially when it comes to the fae and folklore.
Yeah.
It's remarkable.
I relate. All I was going to say was I relate absolutely on everything you just said. I can relate. Right.
So was it the encounter in Ireland that kind of dragged you into it? Because I think most people, when they've got a love of the weird, Brett, they will have had some exposure to fairies or fairy lore or the fae, whether we want to or not, and different types of it. And when you look at your book, the thing that always strikes me is not only the quality and the depth of your work in regards to the art that you produce, but there's also so many little sort of biographies of these wonderful little creatures from around the world. And you've not focused on a particular country. You've got a globe-trotting encyclopedia of magical creatures from all kinds of parts of the world. And I was very impressed to see the Tommyknockers in there as well.
Yeah, of course, they has to be there. But yeah, I feel like my love for all of these things isn't just from one area to the other. It kind of is reflected in, I guess, who I am as a person. My grandma's from England. She grew up there in London. And I've heard stories from her as a child where she did tell a story that I never thought twice about. But she said once in her garden, she thought she saw little twinkling fairies in a tree. And me and my sisters were just like, okay, Nana, sure. But never thought about it again. But she had a couple other stories that were very, very interesting. So I always have that sort of UK side of what I like. And then there's a ton of stuff where I live in the United States. So I didn't want to just stick to those two places either, because there's a whole bunch of other entities that I think are just fascinating too. So I included several other places as well.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most beautiful encyclopedias of weird creatures I've ever seen in my life. It is that there is something for everything. I mean, when I was reading the book, I kind of had an idea that we'd be looking at some of your wonderful fae creatures and pixies, and as we mentioned, I'm always delighted to see things like Tommyknockers, anything that turns up to surprise me, and boggarts and sprites and leprechauns, and obviously the she and the unshee. So when I saw the section that you'd done on cryptids as well, and some of the other European creatures that you'd included, and then you've got wonderful black dogs in there as well.
Right. There
is something for anybody that has an interest in any aspect of folklore or the fae or cryptozoology or monsters in general, or just wonderful legends. Brett, there is a section that someone will find something that will warm their hearts, I suggest.
Well, thank you. I feel like there is so much more. I could make a second edition and keep going, because there are still so many things that could be included. And maybe I'll do that someday. I don't know. I'm not going to stop drawing fairies anytime soon.
Yeah.
So
when you were pulling the book together, I mean, this is the other thing as well. This is not a small book, and it's fully illustration from the front cover to the back cover, right? I suppose for me, when you look at something like this, as you say, I presume this was a culmination of your work perhaps over the last 10 years or so. And so it's basically been an amalgamation of a lot of things, as well as, you say, new things that you've done for the book. From germination to release, how long was this pulling together? Because when you look at that, there is no way anybody, and if you do tell me this, Brett, I'm not going to believe you. There's no way that anybody could say, oh yeah, I started it 6 months ago.
No way. It took me longer than 6 months to edit it, and it's still not even edited perfectly. I started with some art. It started with some little illustrations, which are on kind of those pages that have multiple creatures on them. Probably in about 2016, I would say. And I made 2 very small, kind of like zine style books that both had maybe like 60 creatures in them total. And yeah, then I took those, let's say that's 120 creatures, and then I added about 200 additional ones and far more detailed illustrations. So this book has over 300 individual pieces in it, starting from 2016. So yeah, it's a lot of work. It's just...
Yeah, I love the pages where you've got a collection on. It's like a rogues gallery of magical creatures. I love them. I mean, I'm looking at one now, and you've got things like the Were-You, Shrumlock, Plumpus,
a lot of those are just
fabulous
little silly ones that those were from those smaller like zine ones I was just talking about. And they're kind of absurd little guys, but I figured that they deserved a place in there as well.
No, but I think it's nice, because often I think one of the joys of this particular subject, whichever side you come at it, is that, and I think this applies to anybody that's got an interest in the Fae. I have to say, until I spoke with Morgan Daimler, I was not aware of the layers. In regards to the Fae, I didn't realise that there were people that essentially follow the Fae in a kind of quasi-religious manner.
Yeah.
That consider themselves to be the Fae, that dress like the Fae, that consider themselves to be part of a particular tribe of the Fae. On top of everybody else, like the scholars and the writers and the artists, I did not know any of that was going on at all. And then when I spoke with Morgan, and I'd done some research before I'd spoke with her and seen a couple of her other shows that she'd done and read a couple of her other books, I was gobsmacked, Brett. I just didn't realise, especially in this day and age, because I think 20 years ago, you could kind of understand why people wouldn't realise how popular or deep an interest around the world this is for a lot of people.
And people just laughed at, like, if you brought up anything fairy related, people had such, like, their own idea of what they thought that meant. And it is not even close to what that means or what they are. And so it's laughed at.
Or you'll have some people, as we both know, who the very mention of the word Fae brings them out in a cold sweat. And they don't want to talk about it. They won't even say the word Fae.
So many of those people. And I guess all I have to say about I've had people tell me I should stop what I'm doing, and it's dangerous. And for me personally, I feel like, kind of like I said earlier, they found me, and it's almost as though that they've wanted their likenesses captured in these artworks, as crazy as that sounds. But that's kind of like how I approached the entire project. So I have had no problem whatsoever with them. Maybe a few little tricksy things, but nothing nefarious.
Well, probably just to keep you on your toes and make sure you're
right.
You're showing them the proper respect that they require.
Exactly.
I have to say, whenever I've done episodes that feature on the Fae, I tend to get 3 camps, Brett. I get the people that go, oh, you don't know what you're messing with here. People who go, oh, wow, this is really interesting. I've no idea and I didn't realize this was going on. Or people that just go, what on earth are you talking about, this nonsense? Or and so for me, I find it really interesting that, as you say, I think unless you really go into this properly, people don't really understand it. Without wishing to sound like it's a cliche, a lot of people view fairies based on certain cartoon studios that they've seen films released by, and other people will work on these horrific tales that they've been told from where they live in Ireland and Scotland about horrible things that will happen to you if you mess with them.
Right. It's very black or white. And I have a whole page in my book dedicated to it just being a natural flowing spectrum. It is not black or white. It can be just like humans, just like nature. It just fluctuates. They're not all evil. They're not all little impish pixies. There's a whole lot in between. And I just hope maybe people begin to see that, I guess. But I guess I also don't want the wrong people messing with, I don't know. People can do whatever they want. I don't care.
Yes, for anybody following that advice, please leave out some milk and honey, just in case. Okay? Just to make sure. I don't want anybody coming up telling me that a bogart set fire to their kitchen, Brett.
Oh my gosh. Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. No
Sorry in
worries.
advance.
Only pulling your leg. I mean, the thing for me is, like I say, I had a very cursory knowledge, and obviously I knew about the differences between Ireland and Scotland and England. But then even in England, you've got the guys we've got round here, the bogarts, are very different to the guys that they've got in Cornwall. Guys in Cornwall are very different that they've got next. Mind you, most Cornwall and Devon, I think, just like to annoy each other by saying, well, your fairies are not the same as our fairies. I mean, they don't even agree how to eat scone, Brett. So they're not going to agree about magical creatures either, I think. Two of the country's most beautiful parts. So I'm not pulling anybody's legs at fabulous places, and they've got such wonderful history. But I think when you go around, even in the UK, you've got such variation and differences, and everybody tends to overlook Wales for some reason.
I was just going to bring that up. I included a couple Welsh fairies, and it was really interesting because while I was working on the book, I learned that I have Welsh ancestors. My grandma's from England and was raised there, but her grandparents are all Welsh, and she never brought that up. So
wow,
I just thought that was really interesting. And I had been having dreams about these Welsh fairies before I learned that I actually have some Welsh ancestry. So it was almost like they were asking to like, look into us. We want to be part of this too. So I listened.
Absolutely. Well, Wales is somewhere that I used to go regularly as a child. And I went back this summer for a few days for a break to visit it, because it was the first time I'd been for nearly 40 years.
Wow.
And obviously me going back now compared to me then, all I'm doing is looking for local folklore books everywhere.
Yeah.
And finding out, I'm like, oh my goodness, it's amazing. And the only disappointment was I couldn't find a proper pixie in a shop anywhere. But I did find a wonderful glow-in-the-dark ghost from Conway Castle, which I thought that'll suffice.
That sounds wonderful. I would love to visit Wales one day, especially now that I know about it. I heard my grandma mention things where she's like, oh, I knew somebody Welsh. I didn't like them. So I was like, okay, whatever. Now I'm wondering if it was her family or something.
Yes. It's really interesting because obviously, once again, they're one of those, and I'm sure that the Welsh people are sick to death of this, but it does tend in the pantheon of British folklore. They always get overlooked for some reason. And thankfully, I think in the modern era, there's a lot of researchers and authors who are trying to bring Welsh mythology and the history forward, because they're often like a footnote or a side note in some books and some research in regards to this. I know there's several authors that are focusing on fairy lore. But there was really interesting things like the people who lived in the south of Wales thought in the north, that's where all the monsters magic was. And that's why it was a wild and unkempt land, apparently. And so even in Wales, you've got that split between real Welsh people and the magic, you know?
Yeah, these people are always just dividing themselves.
Yes, yeah. Thankfully, the English brought them together to hate somebody else. So, I mean, when you were pulling this together and diving into it, are you amazed at the level of spread that these kind of creatures are across the world, Brett? Or is it something, as we often look at certain legends when it comes to sea serpents and lake monsters, or dogmen and werewolves and hairy hominids even, that you start looking around the world and you say, hang on a minute, why have they got one in Malaysia and they've got one in Canada? Why have they got one in Brazil and they've got one in Peru?
To me, I'm just not surprised at all, to be honest. It just, in a way, this is not the best comparison, and I haven't traveled the world over, but I've done some traveling. I've been to several cities, pretty big cities, and lived in them, and they're kind of all the same. Like, they're just people, ultimately. Like, they all have their own little unique things, but again, so does their folklore. But there's just so many things that people have in common that it seems like it's always kind of been like that, even though they have their unique little differences, which should be looked at, which are very valid and pretty cool, interesting things to know. Still, people are people. And I don't know, we all have very similar stories throughout the globe.
So it's very similar. It's such as tales of vampires are another thing, Brett, that I've always been fascinated with, that you have situations where you have the panic that happened in the US in the 18th and 19th century, based on the fact that you had a lot of people coming over from certain parts of Europe. But then, as I've gotten older, I've discovered how rich the vampire lore is in Asia.
Yeah.
And they've even got it in South America, that there's always been this fear of the dead rising from the grave and blood-sucking creatures coming for us in the nighttime. So it's, for me, whilst I'm not surprised these days, I still find it fascinating that there are stories in China of blood-sucking creatures, as well as Romania and Georgia and Russia and England, and occasionally you will have really weird, because obviously most people know of the New England vampire panic that I spoke about in a recent episode. And yet, when you tell them about the Great Vampire Flap in London in 1970, everybody's like, what? What are you talking about?
That's one of my favorites.
Oh, that's a crazy when I was in London at Halloween, we were flicking through the channels and there was a documentary about the Highgate Vampire.
Oh my gosh.
And I was like looking on Google Maps, I'm like, I'm only 3.5 miles away.
You gotta go.
Tracy, my partner, did not share my enthusiasm for wandering around the graveyard at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night.
Rats. That would have been awesome. But yeah, that's a very fun story. But yeah, it's really it's super fascinating that throughout the globe, all of these extremely similar stories are told. And I can't say I know why. It could just be a human thing, really. I don't know, but that's awesome. That I just feel like instead of going on and on about claiming you know something when you clearly don't, it's just far better to just continue to be fascinated and amazed by it. It's so fun and inspiring, and that just thinking about weird stuff kind of makes my brain gears turn, and it's just, I get some of my best ideas, more innovations, and I don't know. It's because imagination.
Absolutely. And I think as well, when you're dealing with a subject like this, it's the very same as magic and paganism and witchcraft. I think that the Fae are one of those things, Brett, that some people try to act as gatekeepers to it and say, right, this is the only way.
Right.
Which is absolute nonsense.
There is no way. There's no only way. Every way is a possible way, in my opinion.
Absolutely. I mean, if you came to Britain, you'd have 29 different variations of the phase off the top of my head. You know, that's just me without really thinking about it. And I'm sure there's somebody shouting, going, "Oh, there's at least 36, Paul." But it's one of those things. And if it's that varied, even in such a place as small as the UK, how, you know, what's it going to be like across the world? It's going to be in the thousands.
Yeah. And I guess I just have never understood why being right is so important to so many people. I think it's maybe like a power thing. I'm not sure, but there's no right way. And I think that is why it is so fun and beautiful and so just inspiring to me, because it can be anything.
I think also as well, it's one of those subjects and those pieces of folklore and mystery that you can take what you want out of it. For me, it's a subject, as with anything, that if you try to take all of it, I think it'll just swamp you, Brett. So, because there's so much, you can have too much of a good thing when it comes to a subject like this, because there's so much that I think you end up either getting overawed or burnt out by it, and it probably will put you off it. Whereas if you think, well, actually, I'm just really interested in pixies, that's
exactly.
fine.
It's fine. You like pixies. That's wonderful. And I think sometimes people, like I keep saying I get obsessed with these things, and I definitely do. It's an obsessive thing. But at the same time, I am very careful to stay super grounded. That's very important to me. So my life does not completely revolve around gaining the most knowledge or even sitting down and drawing the most illustrations that I possibly could. I know that it's incredibly important just as a human being to get out and experience life, because that's why I'm a person, you know?
Yeah.
You don't have to be completely drowned in knowing the most, I guess.
Very much so. I suppose as well, one of the other things about this kind of thing, and I get it, you will probably get it a lot more than me, Brett, I would imagine, is that obviously when you do the work that you do, will you get people say, well, that's not what I like. I know what they're like. That's not right.
Sometimes, more often though, strangely, more often people will say something, oh, that looks exactly like Brian Froud's work, which I disagree with completely. And it's really ironic that they say that, because I didn't really get into his work until the last leg of my book, where enough people had told me, like, this looks like Brian Froud. And I just got tired of hearing it. So I was like, I'm going to order some books and see what this is all about.
Yeah.
And I had known about him from things like Labyrinth, and that's about it. But I had never even seen the movie Labyrinth in full up until about 2 years ago, admittedly. But yeah, I really ended up liking his work and reading more about what he had to say. And everybody loved comparing his work to Arthur Rackham. And
yes,
he had the best response, which is kind of what I've adopted. And it's just, well, that's just what they look like. That's how they manifest for me. And I'm capturing this essence. And I feel that very much because I was completely unfamiliar with his work. And we are drawing upon very similar looking entities. Our styles, I think, are completely different, but that's just me, one artist talking about another artist. And I'm not sure that people who aren't super invested in the art world would maybe know the difference.
Yeah.
But I can tell, but I can also see like, oh, wow, this entity looks exactly like what I saw in a dream. And I feel like there's something really, really cool about that. Kind of spooky.
Yeah. Have you been surprised since you've delved into this world, Brett, at how many people are having these encounters in the modern era? Because this is another aspect to this. I remember when I spoke with Joe Hickey Hall, I had a brilliant comment on my Patreon from one of my supporters who said, I have no idea what to make of this conversation, but it was brilliant.
Wow. Yeah, that was a really good interview. She's awesome.
Yeah.
I just talked to her not long ago. So they have contacted me. It's not a ton, but I have had people write me and say things about fairies that I've drawn, which I don't even know the actual names of.
Yeah.
And those are kind of the ones that we were just talking about, like the big pages with the multiple entities on them. And I've had several people write me and say, how did you know what this creature looks like? This description is exactly what it's been doing. And I've seen this out of the corner of my eye, or I've dreamed about this for so many nights in a row. And this book has kind of like helped me put a name to it. So I have no idea what to make of that, to be honest. That was never my intention to, I don't know. All I can say is there has to be something more behind the creation process, maybe. It kind of baffles me, and I never know how to respond because I usually say something that's very interesting because it is, but I don't know what else to say.
Yeah. I have to say, when I spoke with Joe, I obviously was discussing that very strange incident that happened to me as a small boy.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had 2 listeners email me with extremely similar experiences that they'd had.
Yeah.
And
wow.
I thought, hang on a minute, I'd never ever heard anybody else talk about that. And then I mentioned it and 2 people said, oh yeah, I had very similar. Both of them were told that they were just imagining it and it didn't happen. Whereas for me, I was just simply told, well, they're just going to have a look at you.
Yeah.
Which I don't know what's worse when you're 4.
They just want to watch you.
Oh, God. But I found that aspect of it very interesting. And I think it's like anything in regards to when you have an experience as a small child. Often these are kind of dismissed. And once again, we have a parallel of both having a haunted childhood, Brett, where the adults around us just pretended nothing was happening.
Yeah. That is true. Now, my mom did end up experiencing some things on her own, and we only learned that later in life. But at the time, I don't know. It was, she listened and believed, I guess she believed me. Basically, it was a sleep paralysis story, but I was able to move. I was laying in my bed with my blanket on top of me, and it felt like a body had crouched on top of me, but I was able to actually like wiggle around and kick my feet. And, but I was also just completely pinned down. So I wasn't really moving. I was just squiggling, but my blanket was suddenly pulled up with like an invisible fist. I could see that the area of the blanket that looked like a hand was gripping it.
Yeah.
And it just landed on the floor. And I ran out of my room into my mom's room and told her. She said it was okay. And that was kind of that. But then later, many, many years later, she told me that she used to have very strange experiences while she slept. And she would wake up to the very classic bed shaking.
Oh.
And so she said that happened multiple times.
Yeah. So were the events always associated with the bedrooms and you guys being asleep, or were there aspects of just things being a little bit off, silly things that when it happens once or twice, you perhaps brush it off. But then, when you go in the bathroom and there's a bottle of ketchup there for the 5th time in a month, you begin to think, hang on a minute, what's going on here?
So the thing about that house, it had, this sounds so cliche, but it just had a very strange vibe to it. It never felt like the house I live in now feels like it has such a life. It's like such a happy house. I love this house that we live in. But that house I grew up in, completely polar opposite, just kind of miserable and daunting. And I don't know, it did not help that the upstairs was laid out in such a creepy way where all it was the longest, darkest hallway with multiple doors on either side. So imagine like children having to walk up through that to go to bed. So
yeah, were your bedrooms right at the end as well?
That bedroom where that event happened was That's when I finally had my own room for about a month. And then my parents got divorced and we moved out of the house. So that was that.
So do you think it was that kind of situation where your mum didn't really want to kind of...
I don't think she wanted to feed whatever was happening because she knew that there was a highly negative energies going on throughout the house. Everybody could feel it.
Yeah.
And it took, when my parents got divorced, it took them years for that house to sell. And it was just a classic, like, I don't know, pretty normal house in a pretty normal neighborhood, and other houses sold immediately. But there was something just off about that house.
It is strange how you can have, I mean, this is often the other thing. I've heard this so many times when I've heard people talking about personal experiences. They'll always say, well, it's not even an old house. It can't be haunted.
My dad built it. He had the contractor, and that was a brand new house. So it's pretty strange.
Sure. So it was just the land that was cursed then, Brett.
It just must have been. My theory is that whatever energies my parents were bringing because of the divorce had everything to do with what was happening at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was basically, as with anything, and we've heard this a lot when we talk about certain hauntings, that there is some kind of negative charge going on that's feeding it. And that's probably, as you say there, that's probably why your mum didn't want to give it sort of legs, as it were, to kind of encourage it more, because if you all started talking about it, I suspect that your mum thought that would make it behave even worse.
Yeah, I think that's totally, she said pretty much just that when she told us what was happening to her. So it's just...
So how long were you in that house then?
Let's see. I think I was 11 when that event happened to me. So I was probably 12 when we moved. We moved in when I was about, I don't know, 6 through 12, something around there.
Yeah. And is it one of those things that, as you say, I mean, for some people, they would say where you live now, Brett, would be far spookier because, you know, you're next to a little woods. I mean, it looks amazing. As I said on the intro, I love seeing your crazy photos that you do, because sometimes, you know, you are one of the sweetest people I've ever met in this field, and sometimes you do pictures that make my blood run cold. But
wonderful
in a funny way, because you've got to.
Yeah, that's all I've wanted with my work. Create cursed images.
Because I think very similar to me. Once again, you've got a very warped sense of humor.
Yes, some might say.
Hey, I'm all for it. More people should be like that, Brett.
It's freeing. It's fun. It's not. I'm not hurting anybody.
No.
Or I'm just having fun.
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, obviously, that particular property is one of those properties that I think a lot of people would love to be, because it's not so remote, but it's remote enough for you to just basically have free range, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And I will say, this house is haunted in a way. Before we moved here, there was a couple things, because it's a family house. My husband, Frank, his uncle used to live here. Before him, I believe it was a great aunt or something. But before that, or before we moved in, I remember laying on the couch watching TV, and I turned the TV off. I was falling asleep because all of the guys, this family is a very musical family, and they have a barn, and they were all playing music in the barn. And I was too tired, and I went inside. And I could have sworn I heard people coming into the house, into the kitchen, and opening and closing drawers, and possibly pulling out a pan to make ramen or something.
Yeah.
And sure enough, nobody had come up to the house. It was just me on the couch. But it's never, ever been anything spooky. Maybe a year after we moved in, I was putting a record on the record player, and I feel like the ghost worked up the courage to speak to me. I have never had any kind of auditory hallucination, and I have never heard a ghost or anything. This is the first and only time I've ever heard what I think is a ghost. And it just sounded like a very friendly man over a radio saying, hello. And I was just not even scared and turned around and said, hello. But while I'm in the house, I don't want you here either. You can't be in the same room with me. And I think it completely just respects you. I think it's a musician, and I think he likes to be out in the barn playing music. And I don't know how I know this, but other people have said similar things. So it's just how it is.
Well, I think it's one of those things often that one of those little niches of the paranormal that often gets overlooked is the musicality of spirits sometimes, Brett.
Okay.
And I'm always interested when I hear of hauntings that involve music being played or things reacting to music being played. And I think because, as we were saying about your previous house, sometimes I think people can overlook the emotive response that music can give you. And I would suspect if we are talking about disembodied spirits or souls or lost people, whatever aspect of it, or balls of energy or something, whatever, music's going to have a reaction. So why wouldn't that encourage or attract things from the other side?
Yeah, that's very much a fairy thing too. Fairy energies are very attracted to musicians, artists too, but they seem to just love a musician. So even that bit of folklore has a lot of things relating back to music and sound. Has
it kind of done anything else other than that? Or is it one of those things that you can always you feel it more than know it, if that makes sense?
I generally think that this ghost or entity or whoever it is, I have no idea really, but I get the impression it's not always here. As strange as that sounds, it comes and goes sometimes. And I say this because I once, out of the corner of my eye, saw something that I could only describe as being a portal, like very small. And I know everything I'm saying sounds just insane, but I saw this tiny swirling little door on the wall. And it was in the room actually where I heard the voice in the first place. So that's kind of interesting. I never thought about that until now. But yeah, I don't think it's always here on the farm, or I think it maybe goes into the barn where the music is. That's where a lot of very fun, positive energy, a lot of good things have happened in the past. People go there and hang out and watch shows and play music together. So I get the impression it might be in there just most of the time. It's not in this dimension entirely. I don't know.
Yeah. Just jamming from afar.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised, because I think it's once again, it comes back to, like we were saying about the Fae and folklore, Brett, that I don't think there's any hard and fast rules when it comes to that. Why wouldn't playing music or having a band or getting everybody together for a sing-along or something, if you had got a haunted home, why wouldn't it attract something? Because often people try to prescribe personality to spirits and ghosts, and I think when they do that, it's almost as if they give them a certain thing. Now, I'm not suggesting that cooking might bring something round to have a nosy, but there's plenty of things that people talk about having ghosts in their kitchens. And you think, well, were they somebody who was deeply passionate about food, or were they a chef or something like that? So why wouldn't something be attracted to people being happy and having fun? It's often,
right,
especially in this modern era, there are a lot of people that just want apparitions and hauntings to be very negative. And yet
I know.
I grew up with some of the best ghost hunters in Britain releasing books, and the vast majority of them were very sort of middle of the road, amiable hauntings that, obviously you'd occasionally get the odd wailing woman running down a corridor or something, Brett, or a grumpy man going, ooh. But often they were just pretty harmless ghosts that were just wandering around or being cheeky more than anything. And so I think there seems to be a real loss of the positive impacts and the effects that a lot of people, I think, are quite happy having a haunted home or a ghost that wanders around, as long as they're not too troublesome.
Right. And I think like the best thing you could possibly do is approach it like it is either just a fellow human being or just some kind of entity that is on your level of intelligence, or not intelligence, that's not the right word, but just on your level, and you're equal. And just be respectful and ask it to give you your space. And I generally think they are willing to listen to you, in my experience.
Yeah. I think often people jump straight to sage and exorcisms.
Right. They get rid of things immediately. And I think that's almost more of a negative thing, because then you're just left with yourself being terrified of everything. So just, I don't know. It's kind of about working together and just being part of this whole, whatever it is, universe, just coexisting. And I don't know. You don't have to banish everything.
Yeah. When I spoke with J. Alan Cross recently, because he's somebody that does a lot of investigating and goes there, and I said to him, do you ever get situations where people say, I've got a haunting, but they don't want to get rid of it, they just want to know about it? And he said, oh yeah, we get loads of people like that. More so these days, people want to know what it is rather than get rid of it.
Right. I would actually be very interested in that, because I would just like to know. I have ideas of what I think and what other people have experienced, and there's similarities definitely that line up with each other. And I think that's why we come to the conclusion it's most likely a guy and possibly into music. And I would just like to know more, though, if it's possible. So
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'd love to see your sort of take on a collection in regards to the paranormal, Brett, dealing with ghosts and spirits. I would love to see you sort of dive into that.
That could be fun. That sounds overwhelming. Endless.
Yes, well, exactly. I think, well, look, as you've proven in your latest work, there is plenty of things in the world of the Fae to go at anyway.
I have only scraped the surface. Truly.
I mean, when you were pulling the book together as well, as you know, as we're joking about how much there was, is it one of those subjects that you were hard pressed to decide what to leave out? Because obviously the majority of the illustrations and the little bios and chapters, if there are such a thing, are sort of focusing more on the Fae and the fairy and the magical. But there is also, as I touched on, wonderful sections that are dealing with things that perhaps people wouldn't consider to be part of that realm, where you're looking. I mean, I was very surprised to see the Loveland Frogman in there, which is also one of my favourites. But then again, I thought, well, Brett's a bit like me. She loves all these kind of weird creatures. So then I thought, well, that makes sense, because that's just one of the weirdest ones out there.
Yeah, there are some things that I'm not sure that I would feel comfortable touching on. Just from different, for cultural reasons. I don't think it's for me to be the person to illustrate and put it forward. But so I was mostly sticking to things that I was extremely comfortable working with, where I felt like I had maybe even like ancestral connections to, because my family does mostly come from the UK and Europe, but I'm also basically the child of many immigrants into the United States. So focusing on things that are around where I live now, it was what I was comfortable with including, what I felt was right.
Yes. How did you approach the difference between bipedal canines and werewolves?
Well, some people think that they're the same thing, but I'm not really sure that they are. And this is a personal take on it. I feel like a lot of the Dogman stories sound so much more like like black dog stories where they're guardians of something.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was really my approach with differentiating those two.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think it is one of those things because I've heard people who don't really dive into the subject basically say, oh, well, they're talking about werewolves. And then when you dive into the dogman, you clearly get a quick fix on the fact that some of these people who are all in on it are absolutely convinced these are not werewolves. And when I spoke with Ken, we were saying some people will say, well, you can tell the difference because a werewolf has wolf's eyes and a dogman has human eyes. And I was like, what? Hang on. Have you seen both? What does this mean for us? Are they both running about all over the place? And so it is very interesting how this kind of changes, because obviously, as you've mentioned there, Brett, I think the black dog seems to have kind of got left behind, especially in modern American encounters, because they all seem to be dogman when we're talking about that particular thing.
They seem to have not exactly the same qualities, but there's enough for me to differentiate between the werewolf and dogman type creatures, just because dogmen always seem to be protecting something. Like, I'm not sure if I'm safe, but I also want to say I have a black dog story from where I live.
Oh.
I just remembered this. So if you want me to tell that story, I can.
Go for it. Yeah, absolutely.
So, my father-in-law, who does not know anything about, he's glad that I'm enthused about what I'm enthusiastic about. He does not know really anything about these kind of folkloric things that I love.
Yes.
One morning, he's an old farmer. He wakes up bright and early. And he looked out into his field and he said it was the weirdest thing. He saw two gigantic black dogs running together. And he was just like, whose dogs were those? That was weird. And they were so big. And I was just kind of, wow, do you even know? What is this? And then it was interesting, sad, but these two things line up kind of in an unfortunate way. When we moved here, we had these two elderly dogs. And about 2 weeks after he saw these two black dogs running together, we decided that these two elderly dogs no longer had quality of life and they did have to be put down.
Yeah.
So I thought it was very interesting how these lined up together. So.
Yeah. I mean, as well, going back to what you were saying about dogmen, I've never really considered that aspect of it, Brett.
I think like I was one of those kids that was also very obsessed with ancient Egypt, and Anubis held such a place in my heart.
Yeah.
So he's kind of the bridge between the two for me, where he's both a black dog and a dog man in a way. And so, you know, I don't really go super into depth in anything really in my book. It's mostly focused on the illustration work, but I do mention that briefly just for like a thought.
But I think you raise a really good point that I've never really considered before, because whenever I hear about dogmen encounters, the thing that always strikes me about them is that these creatures give off such an air of menace and fear to the people that encounter them. And often they will have situations where they would chase people. And if we're led to believe that these creatures are what people are saying they are, these creatures could easily catch them, no problem. And yet I've never seen that comparison drawn before, where you'd mentioned the shucks, that in shuck lore, that always happens, that people get chased. And there's only a few occasions, Brett, where someone has had a fatal encounter or come a bit of a cropper.
Very few. It's mostly just ghastly sightings.
Yeah.
Leave you horrified.
Yeah, but they're always guarding a particular stretch of road or a particular part of woodland. And
like a threshold, really. It's almost like a guardian to like a maybe some kind of portal to an. I'm not sure. I just like wondering about these things.
Yeah, no,
any of these things.
Absolutely, because when you bring that into consideration, obviously as well as you refer to your father-in-law's encounter, there is a rich history of black dogs in North America, which is something that I think once again when you talk about black dog lore and the folklore around them, it's something that often will say, well, that happened in the UK. But once again, once you open up these avenues of folklore, you will discover that that's simply not true. They're all over the place.
Right. Yeah. And coming from him, it was especially intriguing to me because he truly has never, I told him about black dog lore afterwards and he was just kind of blown away.
Mm-hmm.
But he had no idea. And his main takeaway was they were very big. They were in a field, probably, I don't know how many meters away, but a distance away, big enough to say that they were very large dogs, though.
Yeah, big enough for him to realize that they were larger than normal.
Right.
Wow.
Pretty cool.
Yeah. I mean, they're always the best ones when you have a conversation with somebody who doesn't really know about something odd, and they'll tell you about it. Now, I know your husband also...
Yes, this just happened.
Yeah, dropped something on you. And so, do you like it more when it's somebody who doesn't really know about these things says, I've just seen something really weird, Brett?
I love it because I can see a spark happen behind their eyes. I can see their gears turning, and I'm just... you're in my world for a second. Isn't it fun? Isn't it neat?
So what happened with Frank?
So about two or 3 weeks ago, it was about, he was outside. It was dark out. We're trashy. We have an inflatable hot tub. He was sitting in it. And actually, I had just gotten out, so that kind of makes me a little sad. But at the same time, when he saw this, maybe it wasn't meant for me to be seeing it anyway.
Yeah.
I got out, and he just kept hanging out just for a little bit longer. Maybe 5 minutes later, he came in, kind of wide-eyed, but not scared, just like a little kid. He was like, guess what I just saw? I saw 3 lights hover right above me in the shape of a triangle, and then the 3 lights dispersed and flew in different directions. And I feel funny because I wasn't even super amazed. I was like, oh yeah, that's a thing. People do that. You saw it, I guess. That's great. So he saw one of those, I guess, well, it may not have even been a black triangle shape. It was 3 things flying in the shape of a triangle. So yeah, he is not in this world either. He just knows what he sees me doing, and I don't really talk about UFOs often.
Well, yeah, exactly. I don't think that's, if he was saying he saw a strange little creature running around the yard, then fair enough.
But if you stop looking at my book, just put it away.
But to see something like that where, with the greatest respect, if I'm going to think of a subject you talk about a lot, Brett, I would not suspect it would be strange things in the sky or UFOs.
No. But, I mean, I obviously find them very fascinating, and I love these stories. I've seen a few UFOs myself, but nothing like that. And it's not, it's just very atypical coming from him. I guess that's the point I'm trying to give. Very unusual. Was he just sort of mystified by it all, or did he try and explain it away, or? No, he didn't even try to explain it away. He was just like, that is not a plane, and I'm okay with it. I feel lucky that I got to see something like that. So he had a really good attitude.
Excellent. Well, the last thing I want to touch on is, obviously, because you decided that you just wanted to try and see just how busy you could be in a calendar year, Brett, you decided to open a shop as well this year. So,
yes. I did.
Was this something that you thought you just wanted to do? Because it's the kind of thing, I think, this day and age, that they are beautiful things, and obviously what you specialize in and the work you do and the things that you embrace are wonderful things. And when you look at your shop, it's one of those wonderful things where I love visiting places like this.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it started out, well, I never really thought I would open a shop, but my friends bought this very old building in need of a lot of work. And they opened up their business in the bottom half of it, the first level. And then they started working on the second floor. And it was beautiful. They made these different rooms that were kind of like a big studio size. And they asked me if I wanted to open up a shop. And they're my friends. They're awesome people. And what they were asking for rent was like, why would I not just try this?
Yeah.
Let's just try this. Sure. And so that's really how it happened. And this started very early 2020. So I've had a couple of years to just contact different artists and figure out how wholesale works, get a business license and do all the legal stuff. And yeah, now the store exists. It's very interesting having a job that I have to physically go to.
But one you want to go to.
Right. Yes. I go there maybe 2 out of the 4 days we're open. It's a very interesting schedule where we do not want to give ourselves far too much work that makes us miserable and hate it. We want to just keep enjoying what we're doing and just be very laid back. And it's been working for us. And it turns out that the town we're in has a lot of really interesting, cool, weird people, a lot of musicians.
Yeah.
And a lot of visual artists. So yeah, we're just still kind of feeling it out. This will be 6 months at the end of December.
Yeah.
And so far it's been going really well.
I suppose as well, one of the joys of that, Brett, is deciding what you want to curate in your shop and what you want to carry. So I suppose as well, it's also a joy, but I would imagine it's very challenging not to sort of just go a little bit mad and get a bit of everything, really. So would you say it's quite challenging deciding what not to carry more than what you want to carry?
Yeah, I'll find some stuff and I'll think it's going to be super cool and perfect for the store, but then I don't know, sleep on it, show it to Frank, see what he thinks. And we're like, nah, I don't know. We try to stick with a lot of, it is mostly handmade things, like a lot of art prints, a lot of books that are self-published by people, along with other just esoteric books and things. All the candles are made by me. It's a lot of things that are handmade by people. So, it's not factory made. It's kind of more special items.
Yeah. Are you still doing sort of events there as well? Because I know you've had a couple of interesting paranormal visitors and bands on there and things.
Yeah. So the building we're in, it is above, it's called the Record Farm, which is a record store with a stage. And then there is a barcade, so a bar and some arcade games. And they host bands just about every night. So there's always something happening.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I had my book release party up in my shop. So I'd like to have possibly more events where I invite some artists to show work, have like a pop-up of their own or something, but that's in the future. So.
Oh, fabulous. Well, listen, as always with your endeavors, I wish you the very best of luck, Brett. So where can everybody follow your work online, follow your shop, find out what you're up to, and be delighted by your occasionally terrifying Instagram posts?
Okay, so my personal Instagram is Brett Manning Art, just my name with the word art, and that's my Facebook. And my shop is called The Lantern, and that is The Lantern Logansport. The name of the town that my shop is in is called Logansport, and it is that on both Instagram and Facebook.
Well,
yeah.
The very best of luck. The book is a wonderful thing. If anybody doesn't own it, I would suggest that they find it, no matter what, sell a piece of soul or whatever to get hold of a copy, because it's a wonderful addition to anybody's collection, whether they love folklore or art or interpretations of legends or the Fae or monsters or anything. It's wonderful. Thank you, Brett, for your time, your conversation.
Thank you, Paul. Been awesome.